And welcome, witches and wizards, back to another edition of Fan Fic Friday. It has been a hot minute, and I am sorry about that, between being in Orlando and then coming back with COVID and losing my voice. Yeah, it was not the best, but we're back now, and that's all that matters. When last we left our intrepid adventurers, Milo was talking to Lucius Malfoy in his foyer because Milo had been captured by the Death Eaters and had escaped from their prison. From the dungeon cell, and was now back upstairs. If you would like to get caught up in any of the videos that we have had, if you have missed any of the chapters, they are all on YouTube available to be watched. And there are two that were missing because the footage for it, the download from Twitch, had been corrupted and it didn't work. However, Wolfie and I got together and recorded that. So the missing chapters, chapters 20 and 21, will be released and lived sometime tonight. Yeah, Harry, Ron, Hermione, and Hannah were all under the invisibility cloak, sneaking behind the Death Eaters when they got outside of the grounds and apparated away. So they are currently in the Forbidden Forest. Quirrell is also in the Forbidden Forest. His memory has been obliterated by the Death Eaters when they came and took Milo from him. Which was fortuitous for him because he was about to get his tushy handed to him by Milo. Alright, so the video I was just telling you about, chapters 20 and 21, they're live now on YouTube right now. If you would like to, don't go listen to it right now because right now you're listening to these chapters. But, when these chapters are over, and if you hadn't heard them already, you can go back to them and listen to them. It's the Mirror of Erised and then the Bewitched chapter.
Plus, check out the new format. Yes. And let us know what you think. And,
especially the floof cam. And the floof cam, yes. Let us know what you think of all of those things. Chapter 26. Bluff checks. As Milo has told us many a time, he has no bluff, intimidate, any of those, and usually fails miserably at anything that involves acting. So, let's see how a chapter entitled Bluff Checks is going to go for him. I'm not expecting it to go well. He was being chased. He couldn't see it or hear it, but he knew. He wasn't sure what it was. The forest was full of nothing but silence, not even the rustle of leaves caused by a bird or squirrel. That was his first clue. "Professor, are you all right?" The villagers, muggles, all of them, spoke fearfully when they'd had too much to drink of something in the woods. When pressed, they'd laugh it off as silly superstition and change the subject, but a slight hesitation in their laughter, a tightness around their eyes, the fear was real. The thing might be imaginary, but the fear was real. He could help them. He'd known it. It had been a chance to prove himself, to get some real field experience. Lessons and books were all very well, but he'd been ready for something more. He'd thought it was vampires in the woods. After all, what could be more frightening than vampires? It would explain the muggles' reactions. Why is he handcuffed? Alamahora! And now he was being chased, and it was gaining on him. It wasn't a vampire. He thought he might know what it was. "I think he needs help. We should bring him back to the castle." He'd forgotten. They'd all forgotten. Wizards and witches everywhere had buried their memories because there was something worse than vampires, worse than dementors. They'd tricked themselves into thinking it was gone, that he was gone. But now, Quirrell knew better. "And how do you reckon we do that? You have a cart hidden under your robes, Hermione?" Worse, he knew a way to be free, but he couldn't even allow himself to think about it because he was always listening. Always. So he had to be careful. He would bide his time. Professor Quirrell. The use of his name jerked him back into the present. He sat up, and his hand immediately went to his head as the world spun. Quirrell opened his eyes and stared at a worried face. A worried, bespectacled face. A worried, lightning-scarred face. He recoiled instinctively, a sudden, unreasoning hatred filling him to the core. Quirrell steadied himself with effort. He was used to the mood swings now. He had learned to recognize which emotions were his and which came from him. Mr. Potter, he stammered with his accursed stutter. It had been an act once to reduce suspicion, but his act had slipped once too many times, and he had seen to it that it was no longer an act. Quirrell shuddered at the memory. Where am I? That was unusual. The last he had remembered, he'd been planning to take the boy to dispatch some of his tame vampires. He still had several connections in dark places. The filthy creatures in their cave likely still thought he was bringing them the child as blood tribute. The smirk died on his lips when he realized what must have happened. Suddenly finding himself in an unknown location with no memory of how he got there, there were two possibilities. One, he'd be memory charmed. Possible, but unless one of those self-trained children was secretly a metamorphagus Auror, or maybe a Polyjuice Death Eater, he doubted they had the power. The other, he must have taken direct control. There could be no telling what he had done. We're not sure, to be honest, Professor, Potter said again. Again, another man's... Could he still be called a man? Rage filled him. We thought you might be able to tell us. Well, what has happened? Quirrell was frankly surprised. Had he taken over, he was sure the first thing he'd have done was have finished off his mortal enemy. The four children all began a disjointed story, each starting at different places and clamoring over each other, but Quirrell managed to piece together what, more or less, they were trying to say regardless. So you say the Death Eaters took him? Quirrell frowned. Death Eaters? That hadn't been part of the plan. Had he changed it without telling him? There was no way for him to tell. Their peculiar bond was very much one-sided. But I don't see how, Granger said somewhat petulantly. You can't apparate or disapparate within the Hogwarts wards. We must be outside them, Quirrell said. They don't quite cover the far edges of the forest. We should tell Dumbledore right away, Granger insisted. He'll know what to do. Good thinking, Potter agreed. Professor, can you walk? At the mention of the headmaster's name, he felt a sudden spike of fear through the bond. It always surprised Quirrell that even one such as he could feel something so human as fear. No, Quirrell said hurriedly. How was he going to talk his way out of this one? He wondered when the last time he'd said something completely true was. But we can't tell the headmaster just yet. Dumbledore, for all his virtues, is overly trusting. He will certainly tell Snape, and your potions master will go running to his real master. See, Weasley said, I told you he was up to no good. Granger colored slightly, but said nothing. We can't just do nothing, Potter said. He's in danger. Abbott nodded fervently in agreement. I don't propose we do nothing, Quirrell said. Just let me handle it. Don't talk to Dumbledore. In fact, don't let anyone know you were out here at all. He was feeling increasingly impatient, and it did not do to keep him waiting. Well, if we're really outside the wards, we best start heading back. It could be quite some time. Time they certainly didn't have. If the Death Eaters were brazen enough to abduct Milo this close to Dumbledore's seat of power, they really were active again. So Lucius is taking a hand in events again. It had to be him. No one else had the power and drive to unite his followers, who had managed to keep out of Azkaban. Quirrell was somewhat surprised that they had been able to manage even this. He had understood that the best and brightest of his followers lay rotting on the island, where, he was quick to remind himself, he was certain to go if his true nature was revealed. But why would they bother? Was it to bring him back? But the boy couldn't even manage that yet. Or so he had said, anyway. On the way back to the castle, they passed a large group of dead acromantulas of all things. It only took Quirrell a glance to determine what had happened. Something had caused the horrid beasts to turn on each other, but judging by the pristine corpses lying above the mangled ones, one or more wizards had finished off the lot with a killing curse. Must have been Lucius and his cronies. By the time they reached the castle, it was well past curfew, and after sending the children to their common room, Quirrell's footsteps echoed ominously in the hallway alone. He had long since grown out of fearing the dark, but all the same, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being hunted. Worse, now that he was finally alone as he could be now, he could speak. "You lost the boy. Were overpowered by an 11-year-old. That was enough to trigger the memories. The memory charm that had been placed upon him was a weak one, from someone whose talents clearly lay in other directions. A dozen excuses came to mind in an instant. That the boy had powerful magic was the reason they were interested in him. That he would have simply told the Death Eaters he was as good as being the Dark Lord before he had prevented him. That there were 6 of them and only 1 of him. But he had learned painfully that he did not accept excuses. You simply waited and hoped he would forgive your failures. I'm sorry, my lord. You know what happened. I have no excuse. No, you don't. But you will have this opportunity to redeem yourself. Am I not merciful?" Quirrell felt a rush of relief that was wholly his own. Yes, my lord." He explained to him his plan as Quirrell hustled to Dumbledore's office, listening carefully. It was a daring move. Much could go wrong, and he would be the one to have to modify it on the fly as circumstances changed. No plan lasted much longer than the first contact with the enemy. He could take over his, or their body directly, but only for very brief periods of time. "Sherbet lemon," he said to the gargoyle statue. Dumbledore, again, that sudden rush of hate spiked with fear, sat behind his great wooden desk on a comfortable-looking chintz armchair. As Quirrell entered, a glowing silver doe Patronus he had never seen before was leaving, presumably having delivered a message of some sort. He glanced at it briefly, frowning. Quirrell himself had been unable to produce one once. Well, since he had arrived. Could it be coincidence, the doe arriving on the same night Lucius made his move? It must be. Surely someone as powerful as the headmaster received messages of all sorts at every hour of the day. "What curious," Dumbledore said, sounding genuinely pleased to see him. Quirrell tried to fight down his borrowed emotions with limited success. "What brings you here at this hour?" It was vital that the headmaster not discover what Lucius had done, because he was still unsure about the possible former Death Eater's loyalties. He might still be useful in the future, but not if he were rotting in Azkaban. "Milo is gone," Quirrell said simply. "The vampires took him." Lucius Malfoy frantically rubbed the blinding particles out of his eyes as he surveyed the carnage that had been wrought in the dining hall of his country manor. Some form of skeletal abomination held not by the neck with a single overly long arm, and was closing in on the Caro siblings with a speed that belied its appearance. Crabbe, Goyle, and Manicar were still nowhere to be found. Gibbon and Avery were trapped in some form of giant web, of all things, which had appeared from thin air near the center of the room. Lucius had worked too long and too hard to unite those servants who remained free to lose them to this boy. It was time to finish this. The fight had gone on long enough. The situation demanded it. No one would argue with him on that. Avada Kedavra! The boy, who was flying around in circles dodging curses, whirled around with an expression of genuine fear as the killing curse flew towards him. The fear was just as swiftly replaced by a grin as he muttered something under his breath. Without any form or show of sign of magic, he was gone. The skeletal nightmare stood, or rather floated, in his place, and simply dropped out of the air. The foolishly named unforgivable curse impossibly exploded against its rib cage, harmlessly. How? No time to think. The monster crashed into Junkston, who crumpled with a scream underneath its bony bulk. The boy reappeared where the skeleton had earlier stood, with a surprised Knot on one side, and Amias and Electo Caro on the other. All three lowered their wands at him. They would have to handle the boy. Lucius had other concerns. The boy's tame pet defenestrated Judson's body with, if it had had a face, he was sure would have been contempt, and came loping straight at him. Between the thick webs, the ruins of his centuries-old table, and the writhing, trapped Death Eaters, Lucius struggled to get a clear shot. He heard a pair of loud booms, 6 seconds apart with almost musical precision, from the other side of the room. The skeleton leaped, and Lucius realized he only had time for one last killing curse. He would have to give it everything he had, if it could go so contemptuously ignoring the earlier one. He began the practiced motions. Despite its power, the killing curse required only fairly simple wand work, but stopped. There was no guarantee a second unforgivable would have any more effect. Pertificus totalis. The nightmare struggled vainly as its arms and legs snapped to its sides, and it crashed into the polished mahogany floor, scoring it with deep gouges that would cost a small fortune to repair. He spun around to find the Caros and Knot in a tight cluster, cowering before Milo's outstretched left hand. Somehow, they all managed to lose their wands. No, Knot's was at his feet, but the Caros' hands were bleeding from toothpick-sized splinters. Lucius was willing to bet galleons to nuts that those were all that remained of their most prized possessions. If we survive this, he decided, we're all going to start carrying 2 or 3 spares. Ollivander rarely made 2 of the same wand, but with the right application of pressure, well, everyone had a limit. Give it up, Lucius said. It's over. He would still try to escape. Milo, from what he had seen, was nothing if not tenacious, and Lucius would kill him in the attempt. Is it? Milo replied, his voice nothing but confidence. Merlin, that boy didn't even look tired. I could have shattered their heads as easily as their wands. I still can. Drop it, Malfoy, and I'll let you live. Can he? Lucius wondered. He'd seen the boy do the impossible. He can fly, he thought with amazement. But if he could simply kill them all, why hadn't he? What's more, why hadn't he already destroyed Lucius's 18-inch elm wand like he'd done the Caros? And not. His wand was still fine. It seemed absurd, but if Lucius had to guess, he'd say, well, the boy was out of magic, as if such a thing could happen. The boy was bluffing. Lucius cursed himself inwardly. The situation could still be salvaged, however, as long as nobody else realized. Other masked Death Eaters were moving to surround him, wands drawn. A slightly wild look about their eyes was the only sign that Milo's confidence was cracking. "The moment you try," Lucius said slowly, "we'll kill you. There are 7 of us." There was no use counting the de-wanded Karos. "And 1 of you." Not, who had grabbed his wand as soon as Milo's back was turned, and the 6 remaining active, armed, and unimpeded Death Eaters moved to surround him. Most had been hiding around the edges of the room, as if to escape the notice of this child. Cowards. All he had were the dregs. The best, well, all but the very best, of course, had gone to Azkaban. The best, and in many ways the most foolish. He had little more than contempt for those who confessed to the Wisigmot. "Yeah, well, there were 13 of you a moment ago," the boy spat, "and none of you can come back from the dead." He addressed Lucius's followers now. "How many of you do you think I can kill before I go down? How many of you are wondering what happened to your 3 guards in the halls?" The fool's desperate bravado was playing right into his hands. "Be that as it may," Lucius said, raising his wand, "I think I will be doing the world a favor in stupefy." A red stunner hit the 11-year-old's chest, and he crumpled to the ground with an expression of faint surprise frozen on his face. Lucius was aghast. He rounded on the fool who had cast, fighting down fury. "You idiot!" he shouted. "What were you thinking?" Lucius paused. He'd nearly given away his plan. "He could have killed us all." "If he could have," Snape's oily voice replied from beneath his mask, "he would have." Lucius fought down his anger. The true reason for his rage could never be known. With a cool confidence he did not feel, he gave the necessary orders. There was much work to do to perform the ritual. Quirrell ducked into a side room to make the necessary preparations, and also to catch his breath. He'd never had much of a talent for apparition, and the distance from forest outside Hogwarts to Malfoy's manor had pushed his limits. His eyes barely registered the priceless Persian rug or the painted masterpieces hanging from the walls as he began casting. He had been very specific in his instructions when he'd taught him how to perform these spells. The price of failure, or telling anyone the secrets, would be heavy. Too heavy. Quirrell glanced at a polished silver mirror hanging on the wall as he began. One spell to turn his eyes red, another to shroud him in darkness, one to change his face. He gasped as his nose turned into slits like the snake's, another to change his voice, and a third to alter his robes. He suppressed a shudder, looking at the mirror, as he saw a near-perfect replica of the Dark Lord staring back at him. Wonderingly, he touched the now unfamiliar face. Somehow, Quirrell knew that these were not the spells the Dark Lord had used to appear like this. He hoped to never learn the truth of the matter. He had given him permission, in this one instance, to pose as his master. It was necessary. The fools who called themselves Death Eaters will fall in line immediately and turn over the boy they captured. Merlin knew why they'd done it. A pale, bony hand turned the brass doorknob. His hand, for now, as he stepped out into the hallway, wand in hand. Quirrell strode confidently down the hallway, past an unmoving Death Eater's body. Dead or unconscious, he neither knew nor particularly cared, and briefly past a window. It was then that he heard the unmistakable crack of a disapparating wizard. Close to 20 of them, like an erratic staccato beat, followed by, of all things, the hoot of a barn owl. He looked outside and saw uniformed Aurors appearing all around the field, eyes wary for danger and wands held at the ready. But it wasn't the Aurors that caught his eye. Dumbledore led them, a brilliant phoenix riding his shoulder. A mad rush of terror swept through him, making his knees turn weak and his hands tremble. How did he know to come here, he wondered. He'd been certain the headmaster had bought his story hook, line, and sinker. "Dismiss the spells! Hide!" he said. Quirrell did not need to be told twice. Finite, he cast. Finite, finite, finite incantatem. One by one, the spells disguising his appearance ended, and Quirrell wrapped his purple turban back around his head with quick, practiced motions. It didn't work, Amicus said flatly. Lucius was stunned. After everything he'd gone through to avoid the ritual being performed with a living subject, he'd finally resigned himself to defeat, only to be faced with this. It was unexpected. Perhaps, Alecto mused, she doesn't want to return? They'd done everything right, he was sure of it. He knew that a single misspoken word could result in disaster, but when they'd completed the ritual, the change should have been unmade. Instead, this. Milo stirred feebly on the table. I somehow doubt we need their permission, Lucius drawled, or we never would have been able to summon him in the first place. He tried to keep the elation out of his tone. Like most in the magical world, he was hardly a religious man, but now more than ever he was certain that if there really were a god out there, he was on Lucius's side. He'd been given another chance to make his plan work. In fact, he cut off as he heard the hoot of a barn owl. The elaborate system of wards around his manor had, of course, nothing on Hogwarts, but it did tell him when someone apparated onto the grounds. It appears members of the law enforcement community have decided to pay a call. Gibbon, Avery, guard the prisoner and keep your heads down. The rest of you know what to do. With a series of cracks, the other Death Eaters vanished into thin air. This wasn't the first time the DMLE had decided to raid his manor, but they wouldn't find any more than what they ever did. Or he always left a few minor illicit trinkets and dark objects around. Anything else would be suspicious, but in the end, it would amount to nothing more than a slap on the wrist. Lucius stepped out of the ritual chamber in his basement and tapped the door behind him with his wand. Wooden boards, curled up around the entrance, unfurled with a groan to cover the door. The gap in the wall was seamless. A Malfoy, in the distant past, had found an apprentice to the master wizard who had hidden Diagon Alley to do the job. Not even Lucius knew what had happened to his body after he was done. None but his inner circle knew of this hidden chamber, and nobody still living knew the trick to opening it. Lucius transfigured his mask into oil, which he poured into a lamp nearby. He doubted anyone would ever find that when the spell wore off, and went out to greet Amelia Bones like a friend coming over for tea. He felt tremors in the floor along the way, but ignored them. Quirrell knew the plan needed changing. It always came to this. He'd gotten quite good at thinking on his feet. Despite what looked to him like half the Ministry's magical might knocking down the doors, he would settle for no less than complete victory. Quirrell cast a disillusionment charm and shuddered as the icy feeling came over him. Before meeting him in the forests of Albania, he'd never had a knack for combat magic, but he'd always been good at these. Hiding was something of a specialty for him. Strolling down the corridors of the richly appointed house, he quickly found the small service staircase. The house rocked suddenly, but Quirrell had more pressing matters than the inevitable conflict between the Aurors and Death Eaters around. What the purpose of a staircase for servants in a wizard's house was, Quirrell had no idea, for house elves could simply snap their fingers and apparate. The stairs led him through narrow corridors winding about in plain back rooms and servants' chambers. Maybe the house had belonged to muggles at some point, although it seemed out of Lucius's character to live anywhere that their touch had sullied, until he came to the otherwise unremarkable stretch of wall that he had directed him to. Quirrell tapped the wall with his hand, and was astonished to find a hidden doorway revealed. Alamahora. The door behind popped open, and even his usual control broke. Merlin's beard! ... Too many things happening simultaneously. As you can see, Lucius said to Amelia Bones, the head of the DMLE, while the two strode through the hallways of his mansion near his front entrance. Once again, my home has been attacked by the most brazen thieves I have ever seen. Fortunately, the timely intervention of the Ministry's finest has apparently frightened them off. I am, of course, eternally in your debt." Bones eyed him skeptically. He knew the aged witch had strong suspicions of him, but he also knew that she would never act on them without definite proof, which was why men, and of course women, of principles always lost to those like him, who were free of such constraints. Dumbledore, who had no official ministry standing, contented himself by waiting outside, for now. Lucius led her towards his sitting room. "I'll have Dobie bring us some tea while your men search the house for the other thieves," he said, opening the door. "Though I doubt you'll find—" Shooting up through the center of his luxurious room was a great oak tree. The floorboards were bent and buckled around it, as was the ceiling. "Merlin!" he gasped. He couldn't help himself. Even Bones, who was rumored to chew iron ore and spit nails, widened her eyes. Tangled among the branches were Goblin and Avery, struggling vainly to escape. Both were still wearing their masks. Bones stared at the vista before her, shocked beyond belief. He knew he had to act quickly, or things could quickly become embarrassing. Lucius hesitated only seconds. "Death Eater scum!" he gasped. "Call in your oars!" Milo picked himself out from among the leaves and branches and climbed onto the Malfoy Manor's tiled roof. Note to self: never again use a tree token as an elevator. Being slammed face first into 4 stories of old hardwood was not his idea of fun. He looked over the edge and sighed. "At least I'm not jumping through glass this time." Featherfall. Well, it looks like he had at least one more of those tree tokens. If you remember correctly, the last one was used to take out a troll and go through the Hufflepuff's common room, if I remember correctly. That was the end of Chapter 26, Bluff Checks. We are now heading to Chapter 27, Enchanter's Endgame. Sometime before 7 a.m., the villagers of Hogsmeade were surprised to find a dirtied, bloodied, half-dead, or rather 4/13 to be precise, since you asked, young boy stumble into their village. Again. But today the boy didn't look exhausted. He didn't look lost, or confused, or afraid, or even hungry, making him practically unique among 11-year-olds everywhere. That's true. I've never seen one that's not hungry. He just looked determined. "Someone tell Dumbledore," he said to a random NPC, "I need help." "I'm right here in front of you," the NPC replied sullenly. The boy blinked, and his mask of determination briefly broken, evidently decided to reconcile the apparent impossibility in front of him by ignoring it. Just as quickly as he appeared, the NPC, as far as the boy was concerned, was deleted from existence, as was all non-plot relevant information in the town. Shops, taverns, and potential bolt holes were taken in with a glance and carefully categorized and noted for future use. Houses, paving stones, magical streetlights, owls, and trashbins were summarily dismissed as irrelevant, never even making it into his conscious brain. "Well," the boy said aloud, "I suppose there's nothing else for it." Without a glance backwards, as if Hogsmeade had no further use for him, the boy strode out of town and towards the castle. "Nobody ever wants to send for me," Aberforth said, sounding slightly disappointed. Harry was surprised to find Professor Quirrell tapping his feet impatiently by the fat lady when he stumbled through the portal, bleary-eyed and ready for breakfast. He'd hardly gotten any sleep the night before. He, Ron, and Hermione had stayed awake worrying about Milo. The only thing that held him back from charging off to rescue his friend head first was the simple fact that none of them had any idea where the Death Eaters had apparated to. Hannah had vanished into the girls' dormitories early in the evening to be by herself. "Professor," Harry said, bouncing with anticipation, "have you found him?" There was no need to mention who he was talking about. "Yes," Quirrell said grimly. then softened slightly. I'm sorry, Harry. I know he was a friend of yours. Icy trembles gripped Harry's heart. You can't mean... He isn't... He trailed off lamely. Not yet, the professor said, but at this point, it's really only a matter of time. He was hit by a powerful curse. I'm sorry, Harry. He couldn't believe it. It was impossible. The strange boy had, despite his oddities, quickly become one of Harry's best friends. Milo had once faced down a troll and very nearly not gotten thrown out a window. He couldn't believe it could end like this. It felt wrong, unfair, like he'd been cheated out of something. Isn't there anything that can be done? Harry insisted. We have all this weird, wondrous, crazy magic. There must be something. Have you taken him to Madame Pomfrey or St. Mungo's? Where is he? Can I see him? He's at St. Mungo's, Quirrell explained, but he's unconscious. Their best healers are working on him. Unfortunately, they don't know where to begin. His physiology is so different from ours. He's slipping fast. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you. No, Harry refused to let this happen. We can save him, Harry insisted. I know you're distraught, Quirrell began, but Harry was in no mood for condensation. He didn't feel distraught, oddly. He just felt determined. There was something that had to be done, and he would do it. There's something in this castle that can cure any illness, Harry said slowly. It can save him, I'm sure of it. Quirrell looked stunned. Surely you don't mean... Yes, we need the Philosopher's Stone. Milo Anastasia Leodon slammed open the Hogwarts front gates, casting an embarrassingly short shadow. An 11-year-old's stature does not generally lead itself to appropriate levels of drama. Down the front hallway, the rising sun blazing a brilliant orange behind him. Oh, has the Ickle-Wickle Firsty snuck out again? Came a taunting, mocking voice from the air above him. Casually sidestepping a dropped bucket of whitewash, honestly warning him before attacking, fastest way to waste a surprise round against flat-footed AC he knew of. Milo glanced at the poltergeist. Just glanced. It had taken him the better part of a day to walk through Hogsmeade from the Malfoy manor, again, not including the night he spent in the wilderness to regain his spells. He'd come too far. There was too much at stake for him to be distracted by an undead clown with poor fashion sense. He couldn't see his own expression, of course, but whatever it was made Peeves pale, to the extent that a poltergeist is able to, that is, and bolt clear through the wall. Striding up the stairs to Dumbledore's secret office, Hermione thought having the headmaster's office password protected and isolated from the students contributed to an atmosphere of fear and suspicion, but Milo thought it was simply practical, even though he knew the headmaster wouldn't be there. He didn't know where Dumbledore would be, or what the headmaster was doing, but one thing was for sure. The Oyeth was about to hit the blade barrier, and for that to happen, all powerful, friendly NPCs must go. That said, Milo's plot sense had been wrong before, so he at least had to go through the motions. Sherbet lemon, he said, and the gargoyle corkscrewed upwards. Cautiously, Quirrell must know Milo would drop by Dumbledore's office before heading for him. There was also the possibility of a trap. He climbed the stairs and peered into the seemingly buzzing, clicking, and whirring room. No Dumbledore. No Fox, even. Knurl's knees, Milo cursed. Sometimes he hated being right. Milo turned around, intending to head to his faithful third-floor corridor. He always knew it would come to this. Wait! It was Morty's voice. He stopped reflexively. The familiar hadn't led him astray. Why? Milo asked. For all we know, he's already got the stone and is halfway to his master. Remember what we decided about going alone? The rat, sitting on Milo's shoulder, asked. And, for example, what a terrible idea it is? No class is a party. They're not ready, Milo objected. They could die. Hannah could die. Then we'll tip the cleric. Worse things have happened, and can we really afford to pick and choose? We'll need them. Can't you feel it? The worst part of it was that he could. Just as he knew he had to go first to Dumbledore, he knew in his heart of hearts that he'd need backup, even low-level backup. All right. Milo had to force himself not to sprint down the winding, ever-shifting corridors to the Gryffindor common room. Any time gained by running would likely be lost, being harassed by Filch, who viewed any student running as an excuse to chase. He was assuming they were in the common room. He hoped they were. He could use magic to find them, of course, but he needed to save his spells for what was to come next. Well, 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 a particularly grating voice taunted. What have we here? Little freak, all by himself? Draco, Milo said to the pale, blonde-haired boy with false cheerfulness. Crabbe and Goyle were flanking him, standing exactly a step behind him, like the rear wheels of a tricycle. They probably drilled the formation. I met your dad last night. Kicked his ass, too. Why you Milo didn't even wait for the Slytherin to finish his tirade, cliched comeback. With a smooth motion, he pulled his darkwood quarterstaff from his belt and gave Draco a good, solid whack to the stomach. The expression of surprise on the spoiled boy's face was worth a fortune. Okay, well, maybe a few hundred gold points tops, but Milo wasn't willing to invest a significant amount of his allotted wealth by level in anything involving what amounted to a schoolyard bully. Of course, the WBL system had been shot to pandemonium by Harry's massive inheritance, but the sentiment still stands. Crabbe and Goyle, torn between wanting to help their master and take vengeance from Milo's hide, hesitated one crucial second. Milo's combat skills, especially his base attack bonus, was pitiful by the standards of another class of equivalent level. However, from what he could tell, the local wizards, implacably, didn't seem to improve in hand-to-hand combat at all, unless they deliberately trained in it. While this made no sense to Milo, everyone knew that sufficient practice in anything that grants experience points improves all aspects of one character. He had no qualms taking advantage of it. Crabbe and Goyle were moderately competent fighters for 11-year-olds, but Milo had them lying on their backs in 12 seconds flat. With a needlessly showy twirl, he sheathed his quarterstaff back into his extra-dimensional space and continued on towards his destination, not even bothering to look back. Malfoy and his cronies would be back later, Milo was sure. Reoccurring villains were like pimples on a teenager in that sense. The harder you tried to finish them off, the more likely they were to show up on the night of the Halloween dance when you were trying to impress Lisa Sanders from Home Ec. One day, with a few more levels under their belts, they'd likely be a genuine threat. But until that day, they could talk to the stick. Milo left them, shocked and gasping for breath, on the hallway floor. A few minutes later, he rounded the final corner and arrived at a familiar portrait. "Password?" asked the fat lady. "Squeak," Milo answered impatiently, and the portrait obligingly swung open. "Milo!" Hermione and Ron, who were, conveniently Milo noted, evidently just about to leave Gryffindor Tower for breakfast and class, stared at him in surprise. "How did you escape?" Ron was stunned. "The last we saw of you, you were being carried away by—" "Hold up," Hermione said, cutting him off. "How do we know you're really you this time? For all we know, you're another doppelganger." "Another doppelganger?" Milo gasped. "I didn't realize you had those here, as well. And I won't be able to cast True Seeing for, 5 levels." "Okay, never mind," Hermione said with relief. "It's really you. How'd you get away?" "No time," Milo said. He'd tell them later, in the post-adventure between session downtime assumed debrief. Nobody ever had time to waste telling people what happened when they weren't there for adventures for one reason or another. Instead, they'd handled it in the time between scenes, like sleeping and item crafting. "Where's Harry?" Milo asked. The plot here clearly revolved around the boy who lived, and Milo wasn't about to embark on a potentially campaign-changing adventure without him. Besides, Milo had seen his Expelliarmus in action, and been on the receiving end in more than one occasion. No idea, Ron said. He left ages ago to get breakfast. Haven't seen him since. Milo sighed. And you didn't think to check up on that? No, I know it's not your fault. You didn't know. By the way, Quirrell's our guy. He's been evil all along. What? No time. I'll explain along the way. Let's move. Where are we going? Hermione asked curiously. Where else? Milo said. The forbidden third-floor corridor. It's always going to end there, one way or another. So, about Quirrell, I can't believe he's really... Hermione began skeptically. And then there's a spot where I drink some water. He's really evil. I can't believe it, she said, stunned, as they approached the forbidden door and Milo finished his boring, off-screen exposition. We should tell Dumbledore. Can't, Milo said. Believe it or not, I tried that already. You did what? I mean, Quirrell was surprising enough, but you? Going to a legitimate authority figure in a time of crisis. I mean, what is the world coming to? And he wasn't in his office, obviously. What do you mean, obviously? Ron asked, his forehead wrinkled. Milo was about to launch into an explanation of how the powerful NPC ally had to be out of the way to move the plot forward. Milo suspected an explanation would be forthcoming eventually about how he had important paperwork to do in the East Nowhere or something, but surprisingly, Hermione beat him to it. No, it makes perfect sense. I mean, think about it, she said. Quirrell wouldn't make his move for the stone if Dumbledore were actually in the castle. That would be like trying to, I don't know, hold up a police station or kidnap an Auror. Suicide. So he waited this long to make his move. Right, Milo added. What she said. Excellent deduction, Grasshopper. Grass, she sputtered indignantly. Team! Focus! Big wooden door to get past. Boy wizard to save, Rod said with exasperation. Oh, right, Hermione said. Allaho. Wait, Milo cried. What? She asked testily. I was just about to unlock it. No, you weren't. Do you think they'd lock the Philosopher's Stone behind a door that could be opened by a first-year student, even a brilliant first-year student, in a school for magic? The door is likely trapped. Dumble's even warned us. The third-floor corridor on the right-hand side is out of bounds for anyone who does not want to die a horrible and painful death. Quote, it's trapped with something gnarly. Probably the wanted wizard equivalent of a fire trap or something. Good point, Hermione said, looking somewhat pale. How do you remember his exact wording like that? Ron said. You can't remember anything. Remember the cuddly cannons? No, I don't. I just used auto-hypnosis to memorize the plot last time I had a chance to see it. It took a while with her, he was going to say, with my low wisdom, but at the last minute changed it to the primordial forces arcane being as they were. The ley lines were all aflux. Milo had once heard a bard futilely try to make a spellcraft check and quoted him mercilessly, and there was a fey disturbance in the realms of spirit beyond the veil. So what do you suggest we do exactly? Hermione asked. Milo shrugged. His usual plan was to send the rogue in, tied to a rope, thus making it easier to retrieve the body and all her ill-gotten loot. Torch the door? What? Hermione looked at him as if he had just suggested she sell her mother to goblin slavers. Why? We know this isn't the only layer of defense. There used to be a giant three-headed dog on the other side of this wall, and presumably there's more beyond. This door is to keep out thieves, not a frontal assault. That comes later. Dumbledore probably assumed that anyone crazy enough to try to destroy a door with them in the middle of a public hallway would be caught by passerby. Passerby? Hermione corrected idly, obviously thinking hard. And I think you're wrong. Dumbledore doesn't think nearly as twisty as you do, and he wouldn't put a trap door in the middle of what was, as you pointed out, a public hallway. He's more the type to say the door leads to certain death, but really still give the person sneaking through more than one chance to escape with their life. The dog you mentioned was changed down, out of reach of the doorway. so someone accidentally breaking in could see the dog and, if they had any sense, which by the way they seem not to have, flee. The door is only locked. You might be right, Milo conceded, except on one point. Dumbledore's mind is twistier than mine could ever be. Alamahora, Hermione cast as Milo discreetly moved to stand behind Ron, just in case. The lock clicked open. Right, Milo said. We have no idea what's on the other side of this door. Quirrell killed the dog already, passing it off as unnecessary to save Hermione. He could have replaced it with anything. Trolls, giants. He glanced at Ron and grinned. Giant trolls, dragons, whatever. What's your point? Ron asked. We're going in anyway. We both know it. What I'm saying is, be ready for anything. Milo calmly drew his staff and traded his knife from his extra-dimensional belt pocket into a more easily reached sheath, then checked his magic items to be certain. Robe, belt, amulet, gloves, headband, check. He took a deep breath. All right, party, it's taken us long enough. Let's do this thing, and pushed the door open with his gloved hand. The end of chapter 27. Yep, the end of chapter 27. He just opens the door, and that's it. Let me see the next chapter. Oh, good. The next chapter is blissfully short. We might be able to do 3 today instead of just 2. Because that last one was also short. Why, thank you. I do appreciate the wild applause. Oh. Make up for being... Yes, Wolfie, I will attempt. My voice is doing okay, and if push comes to shove, I do have these lovely Swiss Alpine Herbs cough drops, which actually I think I should take anyway, simply because my throat keeps drying up. Cindy and Wolfie, the Wolf Pack and Gaelic Wolf, hanging out together in the chat. Crazy things have been seen. Oh, just as a reminder. Just as a reminder, the, Ricola! All of the readings of Rowan Reads are now on YouTube, including the previously missing chapters 20 and 21. It was corrupted when I downloaded it, so we weren't able to use it. So we re-recorded it with both myself and Wolfie, and that's now live on YouTube. So if you would like to get caught up and anything like that, and now with the never-before-seen floof cam. Yes, there is a floof cam in that as well. So if you would like to check it out, it is on the YouTube, and I would appreciate the checkings of the outs. All right. Let's do this. Chapter 28. Grappling... Oh, wait, hold on. Let's see how many chapters we have left before this is done. Okay, we've got several more chapters. We've got at least one more day worth of reading. I don't feel bad about reading this now. Okay. Chapter 28. Grappling with the Rules. The locked door swung open without making a sound. Inside was a familiar, large, dark room. Some lights all round, yeah? Milo asked quietly. He'd do it himself, but he had to conserve his magic, even the cantrips, until the final confrontation. With no discernible limit, as far as he could tell, on the number of spells they could cast each day, Milo needed to rely on them to get to Quirrell. But that was the proper state of affairs. It felt right to him. All that solo adventuring, that was unnatural. Wizards, while hardly social creatures, do operate best in groups of less arcane, more giant sword-wielding, possessor of the mighty thews, slayer of a mighty fell beast, meat shields. Or failing that, friends. Milo still couldn't believe he was using that term and meant it. With magic. I am going to read at a medium pace. Thank you for starting dinner. It was like being in a party again, even if it was a party entirely composed of squishy wizards. Lumos, Hermione and Ron muttered, and the tips of their wands began to glow like torches. Blimey, Ron said. Merlin, Hermione said in a whisper. Indeed, Milo agreed, staring into the room. This was most unexpected. The room was empty. Well, Milo said, that was most unexpected. I suppose they haven't gotten around to replacing the dog after all. Shall we? He gestured to the trap door that lay beneath where Fluffy once sat. You know, Ron said idly, I seem to remember this room being, well, bigger the last time we were here. Now that you mention it, Milo said, I think you're right. I mean, it is big, but not that big, you know, Ron said. Yeah, weird. It's not weird, Hermione said. Honestly, haven't any of you ever read Hogwarts: A History? I have, actually, Milo said. He'd scholar touched it a while back, but remembering things read in a flash like that was tricky, much like having a photograph shoved in front of your face only to be yanked away a second later. Sure, you saw the picture, but it doesn't quite sink in the same as if you had carefully perused it. Space is somewhat flexible in the castle, because of the sheer concentrated magic of the place, she explained. Makes it easy to resize certain rooms with a powerful enough enlargement charm. They must have done so to fit the dog in. I mean, there's no earthly reason a school would have a random room big enough to hold a Cerberus, right? Oh, I don't know, Ron said dreamily. I can think of one or two. Let me guess, she asked. A Slytherin disposal chute? Actually, I was thinking a know-it-all containment chamber, but your way works too. After that, Ron fell silent and stared at the trapdoor. Their unimportant conversation was simply to put off the inevitable, and they all knew it. None of them knew what lay beyond that trapdoor, but one thing was for certain. There wouldn't be any more freebies like this room had been. Milo grabbed the heavy wrought iron ring of the trapdoor and pulled. It opened with an oily squeak which rang through the oversized silent room. Through the trapdoor lay a deep, dark shaft. Ron reached down with his lit wand, which cast a pale white light on the walls of the shaft. There was no bottom in sight. Light, Milo muttered, fetching a nut from his pocket. The coin lit up, and with a sigh, Milo hated throwing money away, even other people's money. He tossed it into the pit. They all leaned over and watched the bronze coin fall for what seemed like ages before it finally ceased moving at what looked like miles underground. Of course, it was probably only extremely far down and not quite as ridiculously far as it appeared, but one never knew when wizards were involved. A second later, the coin went dark. Spell doesn't last very long, eh? Ron asked. No, Milo said slowly. It lasts for hours. So what happened? Some sort of counterspell? Ron asked, looking meaningfully at Hermione. Don't look at me like I know the answer, she huffed indignantly. If there's one thing we've learned, it's that none of us have any idea what to expect when Milo's magic encounters our own. I don't even know if a counterspell would work. As she spoke, Milo noticed a brief glimmer of light from the bottom of the pit. It's still down there, he said. It's just covered by something. Something moving, it would appear, Hermione agreed. You don't think it might be spiders, do you, mate? Ron asked shakily. Nah, Milo said. It can't be spiders. Well, that's good, Ron said. But why can't it be? Because we've already fought spiders too many times in this campaign. I bet it's probably scorpions. Milo paused, thinking. He had 50 feet of silk rope, of course, but that hole was far deeper than 50 feet. Maybe if they all jumped close enough together, he could feather fall them before the end? But what if there was something dangerous on the ground? Perhaps if they were feather falling, one of them could hammer a python into the wall near the bottom of the pillar and use it to... Right on, Ron said, and jumped in, without hesitation. There was a moment of crystalline silence where Milo and Hermione stared at each other in absolute shock. Well, what are we waiting for? She asked, her voice somewhat strained. We have to go after him. Milo swallowed, and they jumped in together. They were in complete darkness, save for the light of Hermione's wand and that of Ron's far below them, tumbling down an impressively deep pit. Milo, despite himself, lost track of how many increments of 10 feet, and thus how much damage he'd take upon landing, somewhere distressingly close to terminal velocity. Gritting his teeth, he shook his hands free of his sleeves and readied an action. Featherfall, he shouted, and the two of them slowed to a gentle drift, barely a few feet before touching the ground. Ron! Hermione shouted. Ron, are you all right? Milo had a sneaking suspicion of what Hermione was going to ask before she caught herself. Nah, I'm fine, came his cheerful voice. There's this soft plant thing I landed on. It's lucky, really. Milo realized embarrassingly that he'd been so distracted thinking about Ron that he hadn't properly taken stock of his surroundings. Ron was lying on the ground nearby on a thick green carpet of slender vines. The lit nut was nowhere to be seen. Dumbledore must have had this thing planted to keep people from falling, from getting hurt. Mind, a mattress would have done that too. No, Milo said, thinking. That seemed wrong to him. Suddenly, Hermione shrieked. Snake-like trundles of vine, moving with deceptive speed, wrapped themselves around her legs to the knees. It's Double Snare, she shouted. Sorry, is that something supposed to mean something to me? Merlin's beard! Tendrils pounced like a cat, and suddenly Ron was gone. Crap, 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 crap! Milo swore, trying to avoid the vines. Despite his efforts, he found his muscles refusing to respond, and his feet remained firmly planted, so to speak, to the ground. He fought down a groan. He had no idea what to do or how to move. He'd never understood the grapple rules. Nobody understood the grapple rules. The vines managed to grab hold of Hermione's wand hand, and while it looked like she was still struggling to say something, they were covering her mouth as well. Oddly, they seemed to be largely ignoring Milo, who was still locked up with immobility. He frowned and tried to ignore Ron and Hermione's muffled screams as he focused on what the page describing the rules looked like in the rulebook. If he could remember that, maybe he could remember what they said. He remembered a distinct lack of pictures or explanatory illustrations that would require the initial writers of the rulebook to understand the grapple rules, and of course, they did not. He knew his grapple bonus was +2, but only because that was on his character sheet. He didn't know how that was calculated, or even what it was used for. Maybe if he... screw it. Levitate. He cast the spell, not at himself, but at Hermione. His magic effortlessly pulled her out of the tangled vines. One thing he could remember was that, while grappling, you can't move normally, but being levitated could hardly be considered normal, now could it? However, the snare seemed to have finally taken note of him, and a cluster of twisting tendrils jumped at him. Milo snorted and clubbed one of the approaching vines with his staff. To his surprise, the rest seemed to recoil in what seemed like pain, and avoided him, for now. Hermione! Milo shouted at his newly liberated friend. Do something smart! Ah! The vines jumped him in force, and Milo, for the first time in his life, wished he'd taken the combat reflexes feat. He was dimly aware that initiating a grapple attempt provoked an attack of opportunity from the defender, which, if it hit, negated the attempt. Evidently, this vine was capable of multiple attacks per round, but Milo could only make one attack of opportunity. Still unable to resist, he didn't even know what check to make to begin to do so. The vines effortlessly effortlessly lifted him off the floor bodily and pinned him up against the wall. Cold, damp darkness coated him, shutting out most of the light. Somehow, Hermione had managed to maintain a firm grip on her wand while being pinned. Hermione muttered a spell. Milo didn't catch the name of it, and a jet of pale blue fire launched out of her wand in a carefully controlled burst. Milo felt the vines immediately loosen from around him, and with relief he sagged to the ground. They retreated to the sides of the room and remained perfectly still, as if they were a normal, non-animated plant. He heard the ringing clink of a coin dropping, and his lit nut illuminated the room. Ron was gasping for breath on the floor, but was otherwise all right. It was only then that Milo got a clear view of the devil's snare. Weirdly, the vines were streaked with a sicky pale yellow and brown. Judging by the thick mat on the ground, they'd been shedding leaves for some time now, and dead tendrils coated the floor. Weird, he muttered. Why did you use a plant-based trap if you weren't going to take proper care of it? How did you know? Hermione asked, looking at him. What? That the devil's snare is attracted to movement. The harder you struggle, the more it fights. I can't believe I forgot that. I feel like such an idiot. Right! Yes, that's exactly why I wasn't moving. The very reason indeed. That must have been why the devil's snare only jumped him when he cast a spell. The movement had attracted it. Why did it run away like that? Fire, Hermione said. It's scared of fire. We learned that in herbology, remember? Actually, I'm amazed you forgot that and remembered how it senses prey, because that's far more obscure. It just slipped my mind for a minute, Milo lied. Let's push ahead, yeah? Villain to defeat, hero to save, all that. Dun dun dun. And that was chapter 28, Grappling with the Rules. If you are a D&D player and come across a grapple check, there is a flowchart that a friend of mine forwarded me from online. You can find it. I'm sure you can Google grappling D&D flowchart, something like that. We'll find it for you. And it's very much an if-then, do this, do that. But it's 2 pages of flowchart explaining how the grapple rules work and what you need to do within the grapple rules. Thank you all so much for hanging out with me tonight. I really do appreciate it. If you would like to support our channel by, you can either become a patron, and thank you so much to our patrons for putting up with all of my shenanigans in general. And if you would like to become a patron or to help us out by purchasing a jittery beverage, the information for that is in our About page, as well as on here and on YouTube. You all have a very good rest of your day, and know that if people can hate for no reason, then I can love for no reason. And so I love you, and spread the love and the light. Be Lumos. Love y'all.